whole idea of a ritual is kind of dramatic. We're using drama to open a sacred space, inviting the spirits from the four directions, which is a ritual. We know it from the Aztec dancers who practice it. Everything had a meaning. The feathers represent the Quetzal bird. When they're moving, when they're flying, it seems like a snake. So that is a connection with the land, because the snake represents the material world, and the Quetzal represents the spiritual, cosmic world. And together it's Quetzalcoatl. It's a creative force that will harmonize those two dimensions and provide well-being, intelligence, peace, everything good. The dancers, they lift themselves from the earth, so they do this. They become a planet. So there's gravity that pulls you down, and there's this intention that pulls you up, these two forces that are constantly being enacted. And the calling of the spirits, the moment where you're setting the altar, you invite those dearly departed, the visual part, the drama part, together in the philosophy. Where do you come from? Who are you? So that you can know where you're going and what's your role in this life. In the pre-Hispanic thought, death and life is together. The basic foundation is something that's called ometeotl, this creative duality that one needs of the other. They come together, they balance, and they produce another set of duality. In that structure, you can see life and death needs each other. We're not just going to say, no, I don't want to see death, because we need it. So that life exists, death has to exist. And it's not just a noun, it's a verb, the dying and the living. When do we start living? When do we start dying? It's a very difficult question. It's all one that goes into the other. The first accounts that we have about this is when the Spaniards arrived and invaded Mexico. The Aztecs, who came from a long line from thousands of years before, from the Olmecs, had their practices of how to respect and honor and protect that dying experience. There's many layers of history that has impacted the Day of the Dead as to contemporary Day of the Dead. At the end of the 1800s, a brilliant artist came to be known, José Guadalupe Posada. Posada was an amazing engraver, amazing artist. He began to depict everything that was happening in kind of like a public art of that time, in the form of songbooks or newspaper magazines. He engraved in the face of an indigenous girl with her bows, which was that's beautiful. You know. But on top of her head is a huge hat in the way of the Europeans. So that's what it's saying, is that Mexico, indigenous Mexico, is dominated in the French way. He called it garbancera. Garbanzo bean vendor, very poor indigenous people who would sell garbanzo bean with the mindset of being oppressed by the Europeans. Diego Rivera, one of the major muralists in the 30s, he decided to paint the Katrina, but fully dressed. He made it known in this wonderful mural of Hotel del Prado, where on one side he has himself as a young boy representing the future of Mexico, and on the other side Posada, her creator, representing the past, and she is Mexico at that time. So it's a brilliant metaphor and image. that now wherever you see it, it's like the Day of the Dead. It's the Katrina. It's interesting to know what it represents because everybody say, oh, the fancy lady. Katrina, even the word Katrina, Katrin is like an elegant, rich person. However, it really made a deep statement about being colonized by the Europeans. That's like another really important part of the evolution of the Day of the Dead, because once that happened, it turned from a very solemn, kind of mystical type of celebration into a very joyful and funny and critical type of celebration where people criticize the government. Because along with all of these skeletons, Posada had his editor write verses, and they would always criticize like the leaders or major politicians, or in honor of great people. And this is also part of the tradition of the Day of the Dead. In Mexico, on that day, you see all of these verses. So this is another part of the Day of the Dead that is being more and more seen here also in the United States. You know, now we have sugar skulls everywhere. Well, before there were real skulls. They were real skulls that were set upon pyramids and altars, and as a way of saying, oh, these wonderful human beings who gave their life for our country, you know, for our people. With the coming of the Spaniards, they could not accept that. Although in this time it was considered that they would allow them to bring out their skulls if they cleaned them really well and they printed on their forehead. They carved out, "Pray for me," "Hail Mary," and "Our Father." They would, because they thought, well, that's a way that they'll understand the religion if they asked them to pray for the spirit. However, this ended soon, and sugar came into Mexico, and so they began making especially little lambs, tombstones, everything made out of sugar. And then they began to make sugar skulls. It was amazing how the indigenous people safeguarded their true beliefs within a camouflage of saying, okay, yes, we accept, you know, we accept you, but really under the guise of the Spanish ways, they were continuing to practice their own traditions. And this is something that is very amazing for us and very important to understand how many people lost their lives in order that we could have this Day of the Dead ritual. We are so lucky because this ancient ritual isn't just for Mexican people, it's for everybody. It's this idea of bringing together the community around a cultural tradition that provides maybe closure to certain things that we don't want to talk about death, but it's important. And with children, it's amazing having a way to deal with the death of a pet, or to understand that your great-grandpa is gone and you don't know him, but you can always connect with him in this great ritual. In that just microcosmos, you can see how important a ritual can be. Not just the superficial, festive joy of it, but really we can go deep within because it's open and it's generous. However, what is really important is that we don't forget its origin, even though it's going to go into very different universes, this Day of the Dead.
I'm a son of a minister. One time out of the year, my father was given a hall pass. We could suspend reality and put on costumes and be evil. And when the witching hour began on Halloween, it got me so excited. And I raced from home to home, getting as much candy as I could. And at the end of the evening with my friends, we would pour out our bags on our living room floor and we'd sort everything out, Snickers here and Kit Kats there and Jujubes. And everybody was doing the same thing at one time. It takes a month to set this up. I can't even begin to tell you what it is like for me. I had an incredible upbringing in Ohio, and Halloween was a big deal back then. And I'm trying to recapture a little bit of that. I'm trying to recreate, to capture some of that magic.
I just like things to look not too professional. I love a lot of the animatronic people that we have outside and inside, or just statuettes that look like real people. We have a Dracula, a pirate, a maid. I remember finding this crazy monkey head in an antique store, and it was creepy, but this monkey is part of our family now. He's been with us for many, many years. Ken and I are just creatives, so when we think of an idea, we just want to do it. We have kids come every day. They come and check to see what's new. If we're out front, they talk to us saying, can we please help you build? When will you be doing your big stuff? And we said, okay, come this Friday after school or over the weekend. And they're making sure not too much is going on without them helping us.
I've taken it up a few notches and kind of spread it out over the entire month of October to bring the community together and create a sense of neighborhood here in Santa Monica. That's really what it's all about, just to have fun. So it gives us creative license. It opens up our minds. It helps us to be more like children, where we can use our imagination and not be judged.
It's definitely stepped up in its scariness, because as our kids have gotten older, you know, their friends are coming, and so we want them to be actually scared. Little by little, we've added new things. It's become bigger, more of maybe a spectacle, and, you know, people love it.
The magic happens in that night. You know, people come by and cannot believe what they're experiencing, but the next day, by the time the kids come home from school, everything's off the lawn, all the monsters are gone, packed up, and you'll get kids coming by going, was this where it happened? That's the magic. It's like it happened for them and them only.
The thing about Samhain and its relationship to Halloween is the Celts had this 3-day full moon celebration when the shades from the other world could come forward. Newgrange is Ireland's Stonehenge. There's this dome that's grassy, Neolithic. Nobody knew what it was. On winter solstice, as dawn crept over the horizon, all of a sudden, a beam of light goes shooting down this passage. There were all these stories about these people that lived in the mounds. Fairies that would come take you away, not Tinkerbell, dance with you all night long and kick you out maybe the next day. And when you got back to your village, everybody was dead, because that night would have been many, many, many years in human time. Oral history of a couple of different civilizations that preceded the Druid group. There was the Firbolgs, the Milesians, and the Tuatha De Danann. The deal when the Tuatha De Danann were conquered was that the Firbolg would rule above the land, and the Tuatha De Danann would rule the underworld. They could come up and bother you at any time. And Samhain, losing the sun, losing light, you might die, was a very scary time. One of the big objects of Samhain was to not get carried away by the Tuatha De Danann, who would be out roaming. If you had to go out, you didn't want to run across the spirit, so you wore a disguise. At this full moon, midway between autumn equinox and winter solstice, it was very obvious that things were dying. Crops had already produced their harvests. You couldn't get anything new to grow. The sun was going away. People were afraid. So they had rituals. Samhain was a 3-day festival. And it had a complement festival at 6 months later, in between spring equinox and summer solstice. And those 2 times, that was called Beltane, those 2 times, Samhain and Beltane, were when the veil between this world and the other world was the thinnest, and the fairies could come out. Life is hard, so any opportunity to alter one's reality for a moment or two is something that humans do and have always done, even back to the cave, sitting around the campfire. No electric lights, scary, flickering shadows. The Irish also had an immense amount of mythology. An Irish storyteller is a Shanachie. My father was a Shanachie. He told great stories. Ghosts and werewolves and fairies stole babies out of cradles, but they also had sea monsters, mermaids that were not Ariel from Disney. Just all these wonderful, most of them scary stories. Strange creatures all through Irish mythology. There was the bloodsucker. Bram Stoker wrote the book, published in 1897. A couple of decades go by, film is invented. One of the classic silent films is Nosferatu, the story of the vampire. More vampire films were made and scary films were made through the 30s, and so it has continued to this day. When the Irish fled the famines, many came to the U.S. and brought with them the traditions, telling scary stories. Turnips here are very small, so they segued and started carving pumpkins, having get-togethers and parties. Costumes, not so much, but you'd disguise yourself. If you were a girl, you'd wear guys' clothes. If you were a guy, you might wear a dress. All kinds of traditions from Samhain got mixed up with Halloween. Give us a treat, we'll play a trick. When there wasn't chocolate bars and lollipops and candy corn, soul cakes, oat cakes were the treat, or an apple. I mean, we got apples when I was a kid. When I was a child, in the 50s, Halloween wasn't a wink on what it is today. But that, the U.S., we're the best when it comes to making money out of somebody's holiday. Every group of people, regardless of where they are on the planet and the culture that they create, every single one of them has monsters. Every culture has its scary creatures, and look at everything that Hollywood has come up with. Every culture has them, and they all come out on Halloween.
From an artistic and a literary sense, I'm interested in the relationship between death and delight. And I don't mean delighting in someone else's or even one's own death. I mean that at the point of death, there is a celebration of the opposite, which was being alive. And we see, in the wake of a tragedy, whether it's personal or international, there's almost always a flip side where we're celebrating that person or that nation's aliveness. There's an interesting tension there for me. My series, The Canary Suicides, occurs in bird cages. I don't mean to be flip about suicide. There's a history of depression and suicide in my own family, which is maybe part of why I explore it. There's almost a sense of being a detective when you first encounter them. The audience is trying to figure out how the canary has done it and why he's done it. This piece is called How Many in a Hearse? He has all the standard clown paraphernalia. He's got a makeup table with different wigs and all of his clown makeup and a top hat and a water squirting flower. Yeah, he's got a rubber chicken. You can see on his coffee table that he's had a drink and made some balloon animals. He's lying on a lion rug, which maybe was his friend at one point. He left a suicide note that says, "I didn't feel funny." So I find vintage or contemporary, usually vintage, bird cages and create 1/12 scale dioramas inside the bird cages. Each cage has a suicide note of some kind. Sometimes they're humorous, sometimes they're poignant. They might be an actual note, they might be a list. One of them has some affirmations taped to his mirror for the morning. They also always have money hidden somewhere inside of them, kind of the root of all evil metaphor. So sometimes it's under a bed, sometimes it's in a drawer. And finally, they always have a pet because they're hypocrites like us, so they keep something in a fishbowl or a cage just like we do. When I was growing up, my father was a hunter and fisherman. Now he just fishes. He kind of gave up on the hunt. I think he's mellowed out a little as he's gotten older. I was surrounded by taxidermy growing up because he chose to have a lot of his trophies mounted. And strangely, there was this juxtaposition of dollhouses. My mother loved miniatures, and we had several dollhouses in our home. So there was this sense of objectification of natural and domestic items. There was a sense of the miniaturization of them in the dollhouse. And then also the sense of the almost larger-than-life still life, that you could have this wildness, these animals captive in your own home. And as a child, I remember being just fascinated and, looking at the bobcat rug and looking him in the face and thinking, I could never do this if he were alive. So it's horrifying that the animal has died. You don't understand that as a 6-year-old. But there was this sense of storytelling even then that, thinking about what that animal was like alive and, even playing with miniatures, in the open mouth. I would have, play with little miniatures from the dollhouse with this wild cat. So it was this very strange overlay of two different worlds. I'm also very interested in the Cabinet of Curiosities, the Natural History Museum, kind of these giant reliquaries or smaller reliquaries of information and specimens. This idea that something's sort of holy and preserved. I like that both in the sense of language and in the sense of objects. There are lots of animals in my writing and also lots of animals in my artistic work. I find that they kind of speak to each other. The juxtaposition of my material art and my writing yields new things every day. His master's voice is a failed writer in a hotel room where there's an old-fashioned typewriter and there's wadded up pieces of paper, drafts all over the floor. He just couldn't get there. Sitting over the desk is a print of Nipper, who's the RCA Victor dog who hears his master's voice through the gramophone. This piece made me think a lot about that voice that we hear spurring us toward creativity. That can take us to a really light place or a really dark place or somewhere in between. And there's also that sense of Memento Mori, sort of the afterlife calling to us. They're meditations on captivity. They're meditations on what a pet is. I've had pets my whole life. Pets do not become pets voluntarily. In the wild, I suppose, have what we would call personalities, but not the way that we understand, Fido having a personality. And so I like the sort of back and forth between the wild and domestic. I would say it's very influenced by the Victorian era. The image of the corset and the image of the cage are closely related. In a sense, Victorian women were kept in a cage. The suicides that happen in the Canary suicides have a lot to do with literary tradition. Men writing literature about women killing themselves. Ophelia in Hamlet, for example. And then women writing about their own heroism and victimization. You have Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, that whole tradition. Sylvia Plath is a feminist icon because of her concerns in her writing. Some of her best-known work, like The Bell Jar, her poems in which she's communicating with her father, are deceptively simple and really profound. I really was interested in the details of domestic life. She killed herself by putting her head in a gas oven. It's a kitchen scene. There's food in every shelf of the refrigerator and freezer. And there's a desk in the kitchen that's very important because it's where she's been working. Books by female authors like Little Women on the desk that she's obviously been reading. There's a lot of speculation about why she killed herself. I believe that she was terribly depressed. She had a very conflicted relationship with her husband, who is also a poet. And so there was I think a sense of never being enough, never being good enough. But depression has so many faces, and I think probably was at the root of it. I think humor is at the core of my work. Something that makes me laugh will almost always get me more than something that makes me think. When there's an intelligent laugh, that's an instant relationship between creator and audience. As Dorothy Parker says, death and taxes, it's unavoidable. I'm not sure how I'll feel when I'm facing down my own or, the person who's closest to me. But having a sense of humor in general about death, and especially about someone who's chosen their own, I think just provides a different, perhaps richer perspective on it than simply either avoiding it or judging it. I have questions about the notion of healing. We've all had trauma in our lives to greater or lesser degrees, but I think the act of collaging, whether it's with words or with two-dimensional or three-dimensional art, is a form of healing. As you're saying, my rough edges by themselves might not be enough, and simply visualizing, whether it's in a diorama or whether it's in a poem, can kind of carry us outside of our own trauma and let us see somebody else's journey. And that can be helpful also to just realize that we're not alone, what we're doing and feeling, and mine doesn't feel so heavy.